Oh, come here, you two. Give me a hug.
The word came out barely louder than a breath, but it made Ben Cooper freeze in the doorway. His hand was still on the doorknob. His coat weighed heavy on his shoulders. For a moment, he forgot how to move. His twin boys stood facing Nina, the woman he'd hired just weeks ago to help around the house. She was down on her knees, her arms held open, still wearing those bright yellow cleaning gloves. Her voice floated through the room like something from another time, soft and steady, the kind of lullaby Ben hadn't heard since Claire died. Luke's small hand trembled as it reached toward her. Jake's mouth opened again, pushing out another fragile sound. Mama. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't random, it was a word. His sons, who had never walked, never spoken, were moving now, stepping forward, reaching out, but not for him, not for the expensive specialists who filed through this house with their clipboards and promises, for her, for the woman he'd barely noticed until this moment. Ben's heart felt like it might crack his ribs open. He'd spent 2 years building this house into something controlled, something safe from pain. Every corner was clean, every sound was measured. It was a fortress, and he'd built it to keep grief out. But here, right in front of him, on the polished floor of his own living room at the Cooper estate in Connecticut, something impossible was happening. His sons were calling someone Mama, and it wasn't the memory of his wife. Nina didn't turn around. She stayed perfectly still, whispering gently, like even the smallest movement might break whatever spell had settled over the room. Ben tightened his grip on his briefcase until the leather groaned. Everything he thought he understood about his children, about what they could or couldn't do, about what healing even looked like, was falling apart right in front of him. And he hadn't even made it through the door yet. Thanks for stopping by. Comment where you're watching from. I would love to know, and someone near you might be watching too. Hit like, share, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story. Watch till the very end. The final twist will blow your mind. Let's jump right in. Ben didn't say anything. He couldn't. His throat felt too tight, his thoughts too loud. He stood just outside the doorway, half hidden in shadow, half lit by the afternoon sun. The word Mama kept echoing in his head like something he'd imagined. Luke dropped to his knees now, not hurt, just tired. Jake sat down beside him, resting one tiny hand on Nina's knee like it belonged there. The moment was already slipping away, fading back into the usual quiet. But it had happened. Something had cracked wide open. And once you hear your child speak for the first time, even if it's barely a whisper, you can't go back. Not as the same person, not as the same father. Ben stepped backward before anyone noticed him watching. The door clicked shut, with the same soft finality it always did. But the silence didn't feel the same anymore. It didn't feel safe. It felt unfamiliar. He moved down the hallway slowly, deliberately. The Cooper estate stretched around him like a suit tailored too tight. The grandfather clock ticked somewhere in the formal wing. There was no laughter, no crying, just the constant, clinical rhythm of order. It had been this way for 2 years, ever since Claire died. The boys had come too early. There were complications, nerve damage, paralysis. No one used the word vegetative out loud, but it hung there during every appointment, every late-night phone call, every time a doctor in a white coat gave him that look and shrugged. Ben had nodded through it all, signed the papers, paid the bills without letting his hands shake. He'd buried his wife and inherited a future full of quiet hallways and words like nonverbal, non-ambulatory, unlikely. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't cold, but he'd learned to stop hopping. Routine was easier, control felt cleaner, the boys had a schedule, nurses rotated through, therapists came and went. There were monitors, backup oxygen tanks, floor plans designed for wheelchairs. There was no mess, no noise, no surprises. That had been the deal he'd made with himself. Then 3 weeks ago, Nina Davis walked through the door. She came with solid references and a quiet demeanor. Early 30s, calm, wore her uniform with care, didn't ask unnecessary questions, cleaned thoroughly, kept to herself. She wasn't supposed to matter. She was just part of the background. But the boys had started watching her. At first it was subtle, then it became something more deliberate. Their eyes would follow her across the room, their hands would twitch when she walked past, their breathing would slow when she sang under her breath, so softly sometimes the baby monitor barely picked it up. The nurses said it was coincidence, maybe just sensory stimulation. Ben believed them, until today. He reached his office and shut the door, leaning his weight against it. The silence inside felt different now, changed. He could still hear it, not the song, not her footsteps, just the sound of two boys, voices like wind through thin glass, reaching for something they'd never had words for before. Mama. Not a miracle, not quite, but something close enough to make a man like Ben Cooper start questioning everything he thought was true. And for the first time in years, he didn't want to be alone with the questions. Ben didn't go back to work that afternoon. He didn't check his calendar, didn't call the estate manager, didn't even glance at the briefing the nurse had left on his tablet. He sat at his desk for nearly 20 minutes without moving, staring at a smudge on the glass window in front of him. Mama. The word had been thin, barely formed, but it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't his imagination playing tricks on him. He'd heard it, felt it, the weight of it still pressed against his chest like a hand. They'd said it to her, not to the speech therapist who charged $3,000 an hour, not to the neurologist who gave him PowerPoints instead of answers, not to him. Nina Davis, the woman who cleaned his house. He couldn't even say her name without something twisting in his throat. Ben stood and crossed to the window. From his second-floor office, he could just make out the edge of the east garden, the boys' play area, if you could call it that. A flat patch of grass lined with padded mats and foam equipment no one had ever touched. Most days it looked like a showroom for a family that didn't exist. Except today, someone had opened the windows. The curtains were moving in the breeze, the air smelled like fall, and for the first time in a long time, Ben felt like he didn't recognize his own home. He left the office and walked the halls slowly, not toward the living room, but around it, through the gallery corridor, past the portrait of Claire holding an empty basket in a field that had never been real. He stopped in front of it and stared at the painted sky. He whispered to no one, "Did you see them?" The silence didn't answer. When he finally walked into the nursery, the twins were asleep. Nina sat on the floor nearby, writing in a small cloth-bound notebook. Her back was straight, her knees were tucked beneath her. She didn't look up when he came in. Ben stood in the doorway longer than he needed to. Then, too tightly, he said, "What were you doing?" Nina closed the notebook calmly, set it beside her, and turned toward him. "Reading to them," she said. "That wasn't reading. They like the rhythm, it settles their breathing." Ben stepped inside. His voice didn't rise, but something sharp slipped through. They spoke. She nodded, "I know. You think that's normal." She tilted her head. "I don't think anything about them is normal, that's the point." He stared at her. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize. She just looked present, like this wasn't a crisis, but a continuation of something she'd already known was possible. "They said mama," he said quietly. "They don't know what that word means," she replied gently. "Not yet. But they said it to you." Nina's gaze didn't waver. "They said it to the one who's been holding them, feeding them, talking to them even when they couldn't answer." She wasn't gloating. Her tone wasn't defensive, just factual. "You were hired to clean," he said. Nina gave a small nod. "That's what the contract says." "Then stay in your lane." A silence stretched between them, not angry, just heavy. "I'm not trying to replace anyone, Mr. Cooper," she said quietly, "but they don't understand contracts or boundaries. They understand presence." Ben felt heat rise in his neck. He didn't know if it was shame or fury or something in between. He wanted to walk out, to end this conversation, to fire her maybe, to reassert control. Instead, he asked, "What else have they done?" Nina paused, choosing her words carefully. "Small things. Jake turns his head when he hears my voice. Luke's been trying to mimic shapes with his mouth. It's early, but it's real. And you didn't think I should know." Her eyes softened, but she didn't retreat. "I thought you wouldn't believe me." Ben turned toward the cribs. The boys were still. Their breathing was steady, deeper than usual, peaceful. He looked at Nina again, and for the first time he didn't see a maid. He saw the only person in the house who had spoken to the boys like they could hear her, and maybe, because of that, they had. He left without another word. That night Ben didn't work late. He didn't go back to the office. He sat in the downstairs hallway and listened as Nina sang the boys to sleep. And somewhere between the third verse and the silence that followed, he realized he hadn't thought about Claire in a way that hurt all over. Not once, just long enough to wonder what tomorrow might sound like. Nina never changed her rhythm, not after the boys spoke, not after Ben's questions, not even after the silence that had followed his quiet exit from the nursery that night. She kept folding laundry in perfect rectangles, humming softly as she worked. She still wore the same plain uniform, kept her shoes by the back door, left notes for the nurse with polite, rounded handwriting. If she'd sensed a shift in the house, and surely she had, she didn't show it. What did change, slowly and deliberately, was the space around her. The nursery, once sterile and whitewashed, had started to soften. Toys weren't arranged for looks anymore. They were where the boys had left them. Books stayed open instead of shelved. The curtains were drawn back just a bit more each day. And in the corner near the small upholstered chair no one had used in years, Nina kept her notebook. Inside were pages of observations, Jake's fingers curling when she touched his palm, Luke humming, faint and off-key, when she played certain songs. Small, strange patterns she was still learning to name, moments she didn't want to lose to forgetfulness or doubt. She didn't try to convince anyone, not the nurses, not Ben, not even herself. She just showed up, every morning, every moment. She talked to the boys like they were listening, read to them like they might understand, sang lullabies like the words mattered, massaged their hands gently before nap time, rubbed lotion into their legs, brushed their hair while whispering stories about frogs and lions and stars that blinked back. "It's okay to feel things, baby," she told Luke once, her voice barely above a breath. "You're safe." What she didn't know was that Ben was in the hallway, frozen, listening. He didn't mean to be there. He'd come upstairs to drop off a signed consent form for the occupational therapist, but when he heard her voice, something stopped him, not the words, the way they landed. Nina wasn't performing, she wasn't trying to prove anything, she was just there, fully, as if nothing in the world mattered more than the twin boys in front of her. Ben stood in the shadows for a long time that day. That night he pulled up the estate's internal security logs and scrolled back through the nursery's footage, not to invade, just to understand. He watched Luke tracking her across the room with his eyes, watched Jake open and close his hand every time she paused near his crib, watched Nina lift each boy gently, slowly, speaking to them like it was the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't therapy, it wasn't science, it was something harder to measure. He turned off the monitor and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel in control, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be. The specialist arrived on a Monday. Dr. Chris, credentials from Boston, sharp jawline, one of those men who always smelled faintly of dry cleaning and mint. He'd been recommended by a medical contact in Chicago, someone Ben trusted, or used to. He stayed only 30 minutes. Nina was not invited to the meeting. Ben sat across from Dr. Chris in the drawing room at the Cooper estate, sunlight pooling across the herringbone floor. Untouched tea sat between them. The doctor flipped through the twins' medical history like it was a disappointing report card. "I see the caregivers have logged recent vocal attempts," Dr. Chris said without looking up. "Unintelligible sounds, possibly imitative behavior." Ben kept his face still. "They reached for her," he said quietly. Dr. Chris paused. "Who?" "The caregiver." Now the doctor looked up. His brows lifted slightly, not mockery, not yet, just the subtle adjustment of a man preparing a professional response. "Mr. Cooper," he said carefully, "I understand how these moments can feel transformative, but we must stay grounded in neurological reality. These children have significant motor impairments, non-verbal cognition, likely non-symbolic processing." "They spoke." "Reflexes," Dr. Chris replied calmly, breath against the vocal cords, a pattern your brain is desperate to interpret as language. They reached for her. They'll reach for sound, for vibration, warmth, not necessarily meaning. Ben's jaw tightened. The conversation ended 5 minutes later, politely, with handshakes and scheduled follow-ups, but that night, Ben didn't sleep. He paced the hallway outside the nursery with the doctor's words crawling through his skull like static. Not necessarily meaning. He walked to the living room and turned on the stereo system for the first time in months, stood there unmoving as the speakers hummed to life. He played nothing, just let the wires warm up. And then he heard it, from the hallway, a melody, not the stereo, not the nurse. Nina. She was singing. He followed the sound. It came from the kitchen, dim, quiet, just a low golden glow above the sink. Nina stood barefoot, swaying slightly, holding Luke in her arms like she'd done it 100 times before. Jake was dozing in a nearby carrier, half tucked beneath a fleece blanket with stars on it. She sang slowly, a lullaby too soft to place at first. Then Ben's breath caught. He knew that tune. Cleo. It was hers, not a popular song, not something you'd find in a baby book or parenting blog, a tune she'd made up while pregnant. Simple and strange, with 3 little nonsense words that only she ever used. And Nina was singing it, perfectly. Ben stepped into the room, his voice came out as a whisper. How do you know that song? Nina turned, not startled, just still. I found it, she said. Where's? She reached to the counter and picked up a slim, worn notebook, pages fragile at the corners. She handed it to him like it was glass. She had tucked it behind the bookshelf in the nursery, Nina said. There are recipes, notes, a few poems, and the lullaby. She titled it For When I'm Not There. Ben couldn't move. His hands trembled. He opened the notebook and recognized Claire's handwriting instantly. Slanted, neat, always blue ink. There it was, the lullaby, his wife's words in her voice. Nina watched him for a long moment. I wasn't trying to overstep, she said softly. I just thought the house needed music again. Ben didn't reply. He couldn't. His throat was too tight. He looked down at Luke, asleep against her shoulder. One hand rested over Nina's heart, like it had found its home. The tears came slowly, like his body had forgotten how to let them fall, not loud, not broken, just real. He sat down on the floor beside the kitchen island. The marble was cold against his back. He didn't speak. Nina didn't offer words, she just sang. And the mansion, for the first time in years, didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like something was waking up. The grass hadn't been stepped on in months, not since the estate groundskeeper trimmed it for spring, and certainly not by small feet or soft hands. The east lawn, once designed as a children's garden, had become just another manicured part of the property, beautiful but untouched. The foam mats had long since gathered dust beneath the patio awning. Toys sat in plastic crates, unopened. The ramp that led down from the terrace had never been used for anything other than deliveries. Until today. Nina had asked the morning nurse to help her carry the boys outside. There was no fanfare, no announcement, no therapists present, just a fleece blanket laid gently across the grass, a few soft cushions, and the twins. Ben watched from the driveway. He hadn't planned to. He'd been returning from a cancelled meeting, the kind he would have once rescheduled 6 times to avoid coming home mid-morning. The trip to San Francisco had been on his calendar for months, but he'd called it off that morning without explanation. And today, something in him had turned the car toward the east side of the Cooper estate instead of the garage. And there they were, Luke and Jake. Not lying flat in hospital beds, not surrounded by monitors. They were propped gently on cushions, facing the breeze, blinking at the sky like they'd never seen it before. Nina knelt beside them, brushing a blade of grass across Jake's hand, his fingers curled. Luke made a sound, not a word, not a cry, just a small, surprised noise, like wonder trying to figure out how to breathe. Nina smiled. She didn't force anything. She didn't narrate. She just let the world be new around them. Ben stepped out of the car slowly, one hand resting on the hood. No one saw him. He didn't move closer. He didn't want to interrupt whatever this was. Jake reached for a dandelion. His hand missed, but his eyes didn't. They stayed locked on it as Nina held the stem and let him try again. And then Luke, unprompted, stretched his hand toward Nina's. This time he touched her, not a brush, not an accident. His fingers wrapped around hers, tightly, with intention. Nina didn't cry, she didn't gasp, she just nodded once, like she'd been waiting for this, like it was the answer to a question she'd asked 100 quiet times. Later that afternoon, Ben came home again, properly this time, through the front door, in time for his usual debrief from the staff, but no one met him, no therapist updates, no agenda, only a note taped to the refrigerator. It was a drawing, 2 stick figures with little faces, one smiling, one curious, between them a stick figure in a yellow dress. The caption, written in looping, careful handwriting, read, "Today they reached." No explanation, no clinical terms. Ben stood there for a long time, reading those 3 words over and over. The drawing trembled slightly in the air from the overhead fan, as if the whole house was exhaling. Later that night, he placed the drawing in his desk drawer, then he shut his laptop. He didn't reopen it. Instead, he walked upstairs, not to his study, to the nursery. The lights were dim. Nina had already left. The nurse sat reading in the corner. Luke and Jake were asleep, their hands loosely curled, their cheeks flushed with air and sun. Ben sat on the floor beside them, his back to the wall, arms crossed over his chest. He didn't speak, didn't try to touch them, just breathed, listened, waited. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like absence, it felt like presence. It began with a voice memo. Ben hadn't meant to hear it. He was reviewing estate expenditures when he accidentally clicked the wrong file in Nina's shared staff folder. A space where she uploaded cleaning checklists and supply requests, nothing more. But this wasn't a checklist, it was audio. He recognized the rustle of soft bedding, the sound of Luke babbling quietly, the faint creak of the nursery floor, then Nina's voice, gentle and close to the mic. "That's right, sweetheart, you can tell me, even if it's just sounds, I'm listening." Pause. "Mama." Another pause, then a laugh, not hers, Jake's, delicate and breathy, like wind brushing a wind chime. Ben froze. He listened to the whole thing twice, then he shut his laptop and went to find her. He didn't knock, just opened the kitchen door where she was scrubbing something under the faucet, sleeves rolled, hair tied back in a scarf. She turned calmly. "Is something wrong, Mr. Cooper?" "You recorded them." Her hands stilled. "For the nurse, she doesn't always see what I see." "You saved it in the staff folder." Nina nodded. "I wanted someone else to believe it." Ben stepped into the room, the tile cold under his shoes. "They're calling you Mama," he said, the word stuck on his tongue like it betrayed something sacred. Nina wiped her hands with a towel and leaned against the counter. "They don't know what a mother is, but they're saying it." She met his eyes, steady, unapologetic. "They're saying it to the person who shows up." The silence between them cracked, not with shouting, but with the kind of stillness that comes after something huge has shifted beneath the floorboards. Ben's jaw clenched. "They have a mother," he said. Nina didn't flinch. "They had one, and she loved them. I'm not here to replace her." "You're crossing a line." Nina folded the towel carefully and placed it beside the sink. "I'm not the one who built the line," she said. "I just didn't see a reason to keep pretending it keeps love out." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You think this is love?" he asked, sharp, desperate, the first true fracture in his tone, letting them cling to you like that, letting them think. "I didn't let them think anything," she said gently but firmly. "They decided, you weren't there." That landed harder than she meant it to, and she knew it, but she didn't take it back. Ben's hands curled at his sides, not in rage, in grief, in panic. "You think I haven't tried?" he asked, quieter now. "You think I didn't want?" "I don't think anything," Nina said. "I see." Another silence, this one fuller, not angry, just heavy. "You want to be the one they reach for?" she asked finally. He didn't answer. Nina stepped forward, not closer, not invading, just enough that he had to look at her directly. "Then reach first," she said. "Be what you needed someone to be for you, be it for them." Ben's throat felt tight. Nina walked past him slowly toward the hallway. Before she left the room, she said only this: "You can take it back, you just have to want it." She didn't slam the door, she didn't wait for a response. And the next morning, for the first time since the twins were born, Ben Cooper didn't go to work. He sat on the nursery floor, awkward in his expensive shirt, and watched his sons sleep. When they stirred, he didn't call the nurse. He reached out and waited to see if their hands would reach back. The storm rolled in quietly, not with thunder, but with a steady pressure in the air. Heavy clouds settling low over the Cooper estate in Connecticut like a second ceiling. Rain tapped softly against the nursery windows, a rhythmic whisper that filled the quiet without disturbing it. Ben sat on the floor again. Third morning in a row, he wasn't good at it, this being still, being present. He was stiff in his joints, awkward with his hands, unsure where to look, but the boys didn't seem to mind. They didn't ask for words or performance. They didn't need him to know what to do, they just needed him there. Nina had said it once, presence isn't a skill, it's a choice. So he kept choosing. He'd begun reading to them, one page at a time, his voice lower than it used to be when he gave keynote speeches or interviews. He wasn't sure they understood the stories, but that didn't matter. Their eyes followed the movement. Sometimes their lips did too. Nina still kept her journal, but now it rested on the windowsill, open, unhidden. Ben had even added a few notes of his own, tentative observations, nothing dramatic. Luke turned toward the sound of the bell. Jake blinked in rhythm with the mobile. Small things, but real. That evening the storm picked up. Wind howled faintly through the chimney shaft. The power flickered once, briefly, then held. The house felt smaller, wrapped in weather, safer somehow. Nina brought in extra blankets, one for each crib, one for the rocking chair. Ben didn't leave. Around midnight, thunder cracked overhead, sharp and sudden. Luke startled, his hands twitched, his eyes flew open, a soft whimper pushed from his chest, barely audible. Then came something else, a sound, a syllable. "Maid." Nina froze. Ben sat up straighter, heart hammering. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Nina nodded once, slowly. Luke blinked, his lips moved again, struggling to shape the air. "Maid." It wasn't random, not a cry, not mimicry. Nina leaned closer, her voice soft. "That's him trying to say my name." Ben's throat went dry. "Nina, Maid." The boy's mouth was forming the shape of the only name he'd attached to safety, to comfort, to presence. And then, like a harmony being discovered, Jake stirred in his crib and echoed the same sound. Broken, breathy, but unmistakable. "Maid." Ben looked at Nina. She wasn't crying, but her whole face looked like something had opened. "It's not language yet," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but it's trust. That's what speech is, at the root, a reaching out." Ben swallowed hard. He crossed the room and placed his hand gently on Luke's back, unsure if he was even allowed to, but the child didn't flinch. Jake murmured again, "Knee." Nina closed her eyes, and Ben did too. He had waited 2 years for a miracle, and it didn't come in surgery or science or some grand moment. It came here, in this room, in the middle of a storm, in the smallest sound a child could make, and the unbearable weight of knowing it meant, "I'm here, I see you, I want you near." Nina didn't say a word about the offer. It came in a neat envelope, cream cardstock, gold trimmed. A high-end private therapy center in upstate New York, triple the salary, housing included, flexible schedule. They'd heard about her through someone on the nursing rotation, watched footage, read notes, empathetic instinct, the recruiter had called it, a gift for connection. Nina folded the letter and placed it at the back of her notebook. Then she went back to folding the boys' laundry. She didn't tell Ben, she didn't want to confuse clarity with pressure, and she wasn't sure what her answer would be. But the twins noticed, not in words, not in tantrums, just something subtle. Luke grew fussy in the afternoons, restless even when held. Jake stopped humming during lullabies, watching Nina's face as if listening for something he didn't understand. They were regressing, not physically, but emotionally. The house felt it too, like the air had lost some unspoken thread. Ben noticed. He didn't say anything for days, just observed, listened. One morning, he watched from the hallway as Nina knelt beside Luke's crib. Her hands moved slowly over his blanket, smoothing out corners that didn't need fixing. He asked, "Are you leaving?" Nina didn't look up. "I haven't decided." "Why not?" She gave a small shrug. "They're not mine." Ben stepped into the room, crossed his arms. "They think you are." Nina smiled sadly. "That's not the same thing." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set a folder down on the changing table beside her. "I had it drawn up yesterday." She looked at it, heavy cream cardstock again, but this time her name was on the front. Inside, a guardianship proposal, partial, shared, no obligations, no legal traps, just a space carved out in writing for what had already been true for months. Nina flipped through the pages, her face unreadable. At the end, a handwritten note clipped to the last sheet. "You're part of this, whether or not you want a title." Nina closed the folder. "I need to think," she said quietly. Ben nodded, "Of course." She stayed in the nursery that night, not out of duty, just because the rain came again and the twins had been restless. She rocked Jake gently until he slept. Luke curled up against her chest. The thunder outside was louder this time, but neither boy cried. And then it happened. Both boys stirred, pushed up on unsteady elbows, and reached for her again, this time not with open hands, but with sounds. Ma. Nina froze. They were choosing, not out of habit, not reflex, not dependency, out of recognition. They knew who she was, and they were asking her to stay. The next morning, she returned the guardianship folder to Ben, signed. She didn't say much, just slid it across the kitchen island, her fingers brushing the edge. Ben looked down, then back at her. "Thank you," he said. Nina nodded. They asked. And that was all it took. Not a promise, not forever, just yes. The house wasn't silent anymore. It wasn't loud either. It didn't echo with dramatic change or suddenly fill with the chaos of laughter, but something fundamental had shifted. There was music in the hallways now, not through the speaker system, just humming, breathy and soft. Toys stayed where the boys left them. Crayons appeared in the kitchen drawer. A paper crown sat on the windowsill for weeks before anyone thought to throw it away. The mansion had a pulse again, and so did Ben. He didn't speak about it, the shift, the fear, the way guilt still scratched behind his ribs in quiet moments, but he moved differently, slower, present. He'd already cancelled the trip to San Francisco. Now he pushed back 2 major board meetings, hired someone else to handle the estate's investments, at least for a while. He began therapy, not because someone told him to, because he couldn't keep living inside a version of himself that no longer matched his children. He didn't become perfect, didn't suddenly know how to braid hair or do sensory games or tell bedtime stories without stumbling, but he showed up. Every morning he sat cross-legged on the nursery floor, let the twins climb over him like a jungle gym, changed diapers clumsily with far too many wipes, read aloud from the old children's book Claire had written notes in, sometimes stopping mid-sentence when his throat caught. Nina never corrected him. She just handed him the next book when he was ready. And the boys, Luke and Jake, were changing too. They didn't speak fluently, but they reached faster, looked longer, sounded out syllables with more purpose. They'd started pointing, not randomly, but with decision. They grabbed spoons, held eye contact, followed the light. On their 3rd birthday, Ben didn't plan a gala. There were no photographers, no press, just a quiet backyard gathering at the Cooper estate. Nina baked the cake herself, one layer, white frosting, no writing. The boys wore matching soft blue shirts, hands sticky with icing, cheeks pink from the sun. A few family friends came, the night nurse, Claire's sister Grace, who hadn't visited since the funeral but now lingered longer than expected. It wasn't a party really, more like a confirmation that this family, this fragile constellation of people, was something real. At one point, a woman leaned down beside Nina and smiled gently. "Are you the nanny?" Nina looked at her, didn't respond. Jake tottered forward, clutched Nina's leg, and murmured, "Mama." The sound was soft, but it rippled through the group like thunder beneath velvet. Luke echoed it a beat later, "Mama." No one spoke, no one needed to. Ben looked up from where he was slicing fruit. His eyes met Nina's. He didn't nod, didn't smile, but everything in him said, "Yes, yes, they see you. Yes, I do too." That night, after the guests had gone and the cake had been cleared, Ben read the twins to sleep from the notebook Claire left behind. Nina sat beside him, one boy against each of their shoulders, and for the first time since the night he lost everything, he didn't feel haunted. The mansion still held echoes, but now they weren't echoes of what had been lost. They were echoes of the life that had found its way back, not perfect, but true. 6 months later, the swing set was finally installed. It sat at the far edge of the garden at the Cooper estate, just beyond the hydrangeas Claire had planted in her first spring in Connecticut. 2 seats, wide, low to the ground, with adaptive harnesses and soft rubber grips. The boys didn't run to it, they didn't leap or scream, but with Nina's help and Ben's hand steady at the small of their backs, they sat, one swing at a time, Jake first, then Luke. Ben pushed gently, slow arcs, a creak with each rise and fall. The air was warm with the scent of sun-soaked earth. The leaves above the patio rustled quietly, and somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower buzzed faintly, not loud, not disruptive, just life carrying on. Nina sat on the low stone bench nearby, ankles crossed, watching them. The boys were laughing. It wasn't big theatrical laughter, just small bursts, soft, broken, real. Ben had never heard anything more sacred in his life. After a while, he slowed the swings and crouched between them. "Want to try it together?" he asked. The boys didn't answer with words, but they reached for each other. Ben lifted them gently onto the same swing, arms around both. They clung to each other, legs dangling, heads tilted in opposite directions like mirrored reflections. The swing shifted with the weight, then steadied. Nina joined them, slipping her arms around all three from behind, careful but whole. No cameras, no therapists, no speeches, just the sound of wind, a creaking swing, and the layered heartbeat of a family that had been broken and chose to begin again, not with promises, just with presence. Ben looked back at the house. The Cooper estate in Connecticut stood behind them, grand and quiet, but no longer empty. The windows were open, curtains moving in the breeze. Inside there would be toys on the floor, books left open, a paper crown still sitting on the windowsill, the remnants of a life being lived, not curated. He thought about Claire, not with the sharp edge of grief that used to cut him open, but with something softer, gratitude. She had left them the lullaby, the notebook, the hydrangeas, the shape of love, even when she couldn't stay to give it herself. And Nina had found it, had picked it up, had carried it forward. Luke leaned his head against Ben's chest. Jake's small hand gripped Nina's sleeve. "Duh," Luke said suddenly, clear as glass. Ben froze, his eyes went wide. Nina smiled. "He's been practicing." "Duh," Jake echoed, quieter, but just as sure. Ben's throat tightened, his vision blurred. He looked at Nina and saw her eyes shining too. "Yeah," he whispered. "Yeah, I'm here." The swing creaked again, back and forth, a gentle rhythm. The boys giggled. The sound floated across the garden and disappeared into the trees. Nina rested her chin on Ben's shoulder, just for a moment, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they'd built together, everything they'd learned, everything they'd become. Thank you, Ben said softly. Nina shook her head. They did the work, we just showed up. Still. She squeezed his arm once, gentle, understanding. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air cooled just slightly. Ben helped the boys down from the swing. They stood on wobbly legs, holding onto his hands, taking small, careful steps back toward the house. Nina walked beside them, not ahead, not behind, just there. Inside, the kitchen smelled like something warm. Dinner, maybe, or bread baking. Ben couldn't remember the last time this house had smelled like home. The boys sat at the small table near the window, the one Nina had insisted they use instead of the formal dining room. Luke picked up a crayon, drew a crooked circle, looked up at Ben for approval. That's beautiful, Ben said, and meant it. Jake clapped his hands, then reached for his own crayon. Nina poured juice into plastic cups, set them down gently, brushed a hand across each boy's head as she passed. Ben sat down at the table with them, not at the head, just in the middle, where he could reach both boys if they needed him. They ate together, quietly, with the kind of ease that only comes after months of practice, of trying, of failing, of trying again. Later, after baths and books and the slow ritual of bedtime, Ben stood in the doorway of the nursery. Watching Nina tuck the boys in, she sang the lullaby, Claire's lullaby, the one she'd written for moments like this. When she finished, she turned and saw Ben there. She didn't say anything, just gave him a small nod. Your turn. Ben stepped inside, sat on the edge of Luke's bed, then Jake's. He kissed each of their foreheads, smoothed their hair back, whispered words he'd been too afraid to say for too long. I love you, I'm sorry I wasn't ready before, but I'm here now, I'm not going anywhere. Luke's eyes fluttered closed, Jake's breathing deepened. Ben stood, Nina was waiting by the door. They walked out together, down the hallway, past the portrait of Claire, past the grandfather clock, past all the rooms that used to feel like monuments to loss. At the top of the stairs, Nina paused. I'm glad I stayed, she said. Ben looked at her, really looked, at the woman who'd walked into his house as a stranger, who'd seen his sons not as broken, but as waiting, who'd loved them before anyone asked her to, who'd made space for him to find his way back. I'm glad you did too, he said. Nina smiled, then headed toward her room, the one they'd converted months ago, no longer the staff quarters, just hers, part of the home. Ben went to his own room, sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the photo on the nightstand. Claire, smiling, holding that empty basket in a field that had never been real. He picked it up, traced her face with his thumb. We're okay, he whispered. They're okay, I think you'd be proud. He set the photo back down, not face down, not hidden, just there, part of the story, but not the whole story. Outside, the wind picked up again, the trees swayed, the swing set creaked in the dark. And inside the Cooper estate in Connecticut, in the nursery down the hall, two boys slept soundly, breathing in rhythm, hands curled gently against their pillows. They would wake tomorrow, they would reach, they would try new words, they would fall and get back up, they would grow. And this time, they wouldn't do it alone. This time there would be hands to catch them, voices to guide them, love, imperfect and stumbling but real. Because that's what family is, not the one you're born into, not the one you lose, but the one you choose, the one you build, one small moment at a time. One reach, one word, one swing at a time. Until the silence becomes music, until the house becomes a home, until broken becomes whole again. Not perfect, never perfect, but enough, always enough. The seasons changed at the Cooper estate. Fall gave way to winter, and the Connecticut landscape transformed into something quiet and white. Snow covered the hydrangeas Claire had planted. The swing set stood still, waiting for spring, but inside, the house stayed warm. Luke and Jake were 4 now. They walked with more confidence, though their steps were still careful, measured. Their words came slower than other children their age, but they came, and when they did, they meant something. Look, Luke said one morning, holding up a drawing of what might have been a dog or a horse. Nina couldn't quite tell. That's wonderful, sweetheart, she said, kneeling beside him. Tell me about it. Big, he said, and nice. A big, nice animal, Nina confirmed. Should we hang it on the refrigerator? Luke nodded enthusiastically. Jake, not to be outdone, grabbed his own crayon and began working on his own masterpiece. Ben watched from the kitchen doorway, coffee cup in hand. He'd started working from home 3 days a week. The board had adjusted. The world hadn't ended. In fact, most things had gotten better. Grace visited more often now. At first, she'd been hesitant, unsure how to fit into this reconfigured family, but the boys had welcomed her with the same openness they showed everyone. And slowly, she'd found her place. Aunt Grace, who brought books and told stories about Claire that made everyone laugh instead of cry. She would have loved this, Grace said one evening, watching Nina help the boys build a blanket fort in the living room. All of this. Ben nodded. I think so too. You know, Grace continued, her voice softer, I was angry at first. When I heard about Nina, I don't know what I thought, that you were trying to replace her. I know. But this isn't replacement, Grace said, looking at him. This is continuation. Claire started something, Nina's helping it grow, that's different. Ben's eyes strung, he blinked it away. Thank you for saying that. Grace squeezed his hand. Thank you for letting love back in. The therapist still came, but less frequently now. The boys had graduated from intensive intervention to maintenance support. Their progress, once deemed unlikely, was now documented in charts and reports that used words like remarkable and unexpected improvement. But Ben knew it wasn't unexpected, not really. It was just what happened when children were seen, when they were spoken to like they mattered, when someone showed up every single day and believed in them. Dr. Chris had called once, months ago, asking for a follow-up appointment. Ben had declined politely. They'd found their own way forward. They didn't need someone telling them what wasn't possible. One evening in late winter, after the boys were asleep, Ben and Nina sat in the living room. The fire crackled softly. Snow fell outside the windows, fat flakes that caught the light. I've been thinking, Ben said. Nina looked up from her book. About the future, their schooling, what comes next. Nina set the book aside, and I want to make sure we're ready, that they have what they need, but I also, he paused, searching for the words. I don't want to plan away the present. I spent so long trying to control everything, trying to prevent pain, that I missed what was right in front of me. Nina smiled. So what are you proposing? That we take it one day at a time, keep doing what we're doing, stay present, let them lead. I think that sounds perfect, Nina said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, then Ben spoke again. Nina. Yes. I don't say this enough, but you saved them, you saved all of us. Nina shook her head gently. I didn't save anyone, Ben, I just loved them, that's all I did, love them and show up. That's everything, Ben said quietly. No, Nina replied, her voice warm. What's everything is that you learned to do it too. That's the real miracle here, not that they spoke or walked, but that you found your way back to them, that you let yourself be a father again. Ben felt the words settle into him, true and uncomfortable and freeing all at once. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the house held them all, imperfect and healing and whole. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The hydrangeas bloomed again, purple and blue and pink. The swing set was cleaned and oiled. The garden came back to life. Luke and Jake ran through the grass, their laughter echoing across the estate. Not perfectly, not without stumbles, but they ran. Nina chased them, her yellow dress bright against the green lawn. Ben followed at a distance, slower, watching them all with something that felt like peace. This was the life they'd built, not the one he'd planned. Not the one in the glossy family portraits or the architectural magazines, but a real one, a lived one, a loved one. And at night, when the house was quiet and the boys were dreaming, Ben would stand in the hallway and listen, not to silence anymore, but to the sound of breathing, of life continuing, of a family that had found each other in the ruins and decided to build something new. The Cooper estate in Connecticut stood as it always had, grand and beautiful and old, but now it held something it hadn't held in years. It held a home. And that, Ben thought, as he finally turned off the hallway light and headed to bed, was more than enough. It was everything. Dear friend, what you just saw is only a piece of the bigger story. In the next video, a twist no one saw coming will be revealed. Make sure you're here for it. I'd love to hear what you would have done in this situation. Drop your thoughts below. I read every single comment. Thanks so much for watching. Show some love by liking, subscribing, and sharing this with someone who needs to see it.